The November air in Enid, Illinois, carried a kind of stillness that only small towns seem to own. Nights were quiet here, not in the way cities called quiet, but truly silent, where even the rustle of a leaf or the creak of an old porch step could feel like a voice in the dark. The Dardeen family lived on the outskirts, in a modest white trailer sitting on a small patch of land just off Route 37. It wasn't much, not compared to the larger houses near Mount Vernon, but to Keith and Elaine, it was home. They didn't need anything bigger, not when life already felt full. Their 3-year-old son, Peter, had a way of turning the smallest corners into playgrounds, and in just a few weeks, they were expecting another baby, a little girl if the sonogram was right. Elaine, with her soft smile and slow, careful movements, had already begun folding the tiny onesies and arranging them neatly in a basket beside the crib. Keith worked at the nearby water treatment plant in Mount Vernon, an unglamorous but steady job that kept bills paid and the pantry stocked. He was the kind of man who never missed a shift and would still show up early just to chat with co-workers over stale coffee in the break room. His friends there knew him as quiet but good-natured, someone who valued keeping his head down, doing his work, and going home to his family. Elaine stayed home with Peter, making their little trailer a place that somehow always smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry soap. She was soft-spoken, the type who remembered birthdays and brought cookies to church, bake sales without anyone having to ask. Life in Enid didn't demand much from them, and they liked it that way. The town wasn't large, just a scattering of homes, a couple of gas stations, a diner, and a few churches that seemed to hold most of the town together. Everybody knew everybody, or at least knew of them. The Dardeens weren't flashy, weren't the type to get tangled in gossip. They attended Sunday service, paid their bills on time, waved politely to neighbors, and kept to themselves. Yet in the months before that November, something in the air had shifted. Keith had noticed it first. Stories whispered at work about strange things happening in Jefferson County, random acts of violence, things people said didn't happen in towns like theirs. A woman had been beaten in her own driveway a few miles away. A drifter had been spotted hanging around the truck stop, staring at customers in a way that made people uncomfortable. There were rumors about 2 unsolved murders over in Mount Vernon. No robbery, no clear motive, just lives taken for no apparent reason. Keith wasn't the paranoid type, but he started locking the trailer door more religiously, checking the windows before bed. It wasn't fear so much as a gnawing unease, the kind you couldn't quite put into words. Elaine brushed off his concerns most nights. "This is Enid," she'd say, folding laundry with one hand and rubbing her belly with the other. "People talk, it's always been safe here." But Keith would just nod without reply. He'd grown up in a small town too, and knew that while safety felt like a given, it could disappear faster than anyone wanted to believe. He also knew that people in small towns tended to lull themselves into thinking nothing bad could ever happen to them, until it did. As the days got shorter and colder, their routine stayed the same. Keith would get up before sunrise, the floorboards creaking under his work boots, as he moved through the dark to make coffee. Elaine would stir awake when he kissed her forehead, whispering a quick goodbye before heading out. Peter, still tangled in his dinosaur print sheets, would usually wake later to the smell of pancakes or oatmeal, depending on the morning. Afternoons meant coloring books, cartoons, and Peter's growing fascination with toy trains. Evenings were quiet, dinner, dishes, a little television. Then they lived a life that should have gone on untouched, but Keith couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Sometimes coming home from work, he'd notice a car idling too long near the road that ran past their trailer. Other times he'd swear he saw headlights parked far off in the distance, facing toward their home. It might have been nothing, someone lost, a neighbor's visitor, but it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He told a friend at work that if things kept getting bad around the area, they might just move. It wasn't worth the risk, not with a pregnant wife and a small child. The friend laughed it off, said Keith was worrying too much. But Keith wasn't joking. That last week in mid-November, The wind seemed to carry a sharper bite. A storm had passed through, leaving the ground soft, and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Elaine had been more tired lately, her back aching from the pregnancy. Keith picked up extra small chores without complaint: laundry, dishes, taking out the trash, wanting her to rest as much as she could before the baby came. Peter had been excited about the idea of being a big brother, though his version of helping mostly meant bringing all his toys into the baby's room and leaving them there in a heap. On the evening before it all began, Keith had come home from work later than usual. The plant had been short-staffed, and he'd stayed to help finish a job. By the time he walked through the trailer door, Elaine was setting plates on the table, and Peter was tugging at his father's jacket, eager to tell him about a picture he'd drawn. They ate together like always, the conversation simple: what Peter did during the day, what Keith heard at work, what still needed to be done before the baby arrived. There was comfort in the sameness. They didn't know it was the last ordinary dinner they'd ever had. After Peter was asleep, Keith and Elaine sat in the living room for a while. The TV murmured in the background, a weather forecast warning of colder nights ahead. Keith mentioned again the strange feeling he'd had lately, the idea of maybe moving sooner rather than later. Elaine leaned against him, her hand resting on his knee. "We'll be fine," she said softly, though there was the faintest shadow in her voice this time. Maybe she was starting to feel it too, that imperceptible shift in the air, the way the dark outside seemed thicker than it should have been. Keith didn't push it further. He didn't want to end the night on worry. The next morning, he woke before dawn, the sky still black outside the kitchen window. He made coffee, the familiar gurgle of the machine a small comfort. He stood there for a moment, looking out into the emptiness beyond their yard. No lights, no movement, just stillness. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to believe that the unease was nothing more than tired nerves. By the time he left for work, the trailer was quiet, except for Elaine's soft breathing from the bedroom. He glanced back once before closing the door, a habit he'd picked up without realizing. The day at the plant passed like any other. Machines humming, co-workers trading small talk, lunch eaten out of brown paper bags. But Keith couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, not something specific, just something. He kept it to himself, not wanting to sound crazy. He didn't know that by the time the sun set again, everything he loved would be gone. He didn't know that this tiny patch of Illinois, so ordinary and unremarkable, would soon become the site of one of the most brutal and baffling family murders the state had ever seen. It was Friday, November 18th, 1987, and the cold came down hard that night, a damp bone-deep chill that made the wind whistle against the thin walls of the Dardeen trailer. The days had shortened enough that darkness fell before Keith even left the plant. Streetlights along the main road blinked into life as he drove home, his headlights sweeping over bare cornfields and the occasional farmhouse. The route was so familiar, he could have driven it blindfolded, yet lately, every shadow seemed a little deeper, every bend in the road a little more watchful. When he turned onto the gravel drive that led to the trailer, he noticed nothing out of place, just the faint glow of the kitchen light spilling through the curtains, and the shadowy shape of Elaine moving around inside. It was the sight he always loved coming home to. Inside, the warmth and smell of dinner wrapped around him, chasing away the night. Peter bounded into the room the moment he stepped through the door, his small hands grabbing at his father's legs, babbling about how he'd seen a squirrel outside earlier that day. Keith laughed, scooping him up and spinning him once before setting him down. The evening was quiet, ordinary in all the ways Keith had come to value. They ate together at the small table, Peter chattering, while Elaine smiled and listened. The television murmured in the background later as Keith flipped through the channels, looking for a movie while Elaine settled on the couch with a blanket draped over her swollen belly. They talked about baby names again, tossing out suggestions and dismissing most of them with gentle tease. It was the kind of night that should have gone on forever. At some point, the wind outside picked up, rattling the aluminum siding. Elaine glanced toward the window. "Feels colder tonight," she murmured. Keith nodded, getting up to check the door. He'd been doing that more lately, locking it early, making sure the deadbolt was turned all the way. Elaine noticed, of course, but she didn't comment this time. She had seen the same news stories he had. Even in quiet corners of Illinois, there were strangers with bad intentions. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Keith listened to the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the trailer settling in the cold. Elaine's breathing was slow and steady beside him, but he stayed awake a while longer, staring into the dark. Something gnawed at him, a low, restless feeling he couldn't shake. He thought about his conversation from earlier in the week with a coworker, the one where he'd mentioned maybe moving away before the baby came. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but deep down he felt time running out, though he couldn't have explained why. The next day passed without incident, though Keith's unease lingered. He worked his shift, came home, and tried to focus on the normal rhythm of family. Saturday morning dawned cold but bright. Keith had promised to take Peter into town to get a small toy train he'd been eyeing at the general store. Elaine kissed them both before they left, her hands lingering on Peter's shoulder. The town was busier than usual, holiday displays already going up in the store windows, people bundled in coats, carrying paper bags of early Christmas shopping. Keith bought the train and picked up a few groceries before heading back. On the drive home, he thought again about how much he liked this place, how safe it was supposed to be. The thought came with a bitter edge. That evening, a light snow began to fall, soft flakes, catching in the trailer's porch light. Inside, the Dardeens made popcorn and watched television. Peter played with his new train until Elaine coaxed him into bed. Keith stayed up a little later, flipping through the channels, not really watching. His mind kept wandering back to the crime stories he'd been hearing. The details were always sparse, but enough to plant seeds of worry. Families found murdered, doors locked from the inside, no signs of struggle until it was too late. Before he finally went to bed, Keith walked the length of the trailer, checking every window and door. Out the back, beyond the yard, the snow had coated the ground in a thin, pale sheet. He thought he saw tire tracks far off toward the road, faint and half-covered. Probably nothing, he told himself. Maybe someone turning around. He locked the door anyway. Sunday morning, the family went to church like always. The service was warm and familiar, hymns echoing in the small building, the minister speaking about gratitude and faith. Neighbors smiled and asked Elaine how she was feeling, commented on how big Peter was getting. No one had any sense of the darkness creeping closer. That night, the last before it happened, Keith found himself unable to relax. After Peter went to bed, he and Elaine sat in the kitchen with mugs of tea, the soft whistle of wind outside. Keith talked about moving again, about finding a place in a busier part of the county where there were more people around. Elaine frowned, not because she didn't take him seriously, but because she hated the thought of leaving behind the life they'd built. "We'll be fine," she said again, but there was hesitation this time. They didn't know that someone had already been watching them, that even now, somewhere out in the dark, footsteps were waiting for the right moment. They didn't know that the locks Keith checked so faithfully would soon mean nothing, that the warmth of their small home would be shattered by something so violent it would make headlines across the state. When Keith lay down that night, sleep came fitfully. Dreams shifted into fragments, cold fields, faceless figures at the edge of the yard, the sound of a baby crying in the distance. Somewhere in the middle of the night, a car passed along the road, its headlights sweeping across the wall of the bedroom. Keith stirred but didn't get up. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself they were safe. The next morning, he would leave for work like always. He would kiss Elaine's forehead, ruffle Peter's hair, and step out into the chill. He wouldn't know it was the last time he'd see them alive. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the trailer would be silent, its windows dark, the snow outside marked only by footprints leading and never coming out. Monday, November 23rd, began like any other workday at the water treatment plant. The morning was cold enough to sting the skin, frost clinging to windshields, the air still and brittle. Keith's absence was noticed almost immediately. He was the kind of man who never missed a shift, and if for some reason he did, he called ahead. But that morning the clock ticked past his usual arrival time, and there was no sign of him. His supervisor, assuming there had been a car problem or some delay, gave it another half hour, then an hour. By the time lunch rolled around, concern had replaced annoyance. Calls were made to Keith's home phone to friends who might have heard from him, but each one ended in the same hollow ring. By mid-afternoon, that concern tipped toward unease. It wasn't just Keith who was unreachable. No one at the Dardeen home was answering. Elaine wasn't the type to be out all day without telling someone. Peter was too young for school, and she rarely left the house, except for errands. The silence felt wrong. Eventually, a request was made for someone to check on the family. 2 deputies from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department were sent to the trailer. The drive out was unremarkable. Empty fields, bare trees shivering in the wind, the occasional passing truck. The deputies chatted idly at first, though both admitted they'd heard about Keith mentioning strange activity near his home. When they turned onto the gravel drive, the first thing they noticed was that Keith's car wasn't there. The second was that the curtains were drawn tight, even though it was mid-afternoon. One deputy approached the front door and knocked hard. The sound seemed to vanish into the cold air. No answering footsteps, no voices inside. He knocked again, calling out their names. Still nothing. They circled the trailer, peering through a narrow gap in one curtain. What little they could see inside was dim shapes of furniture, the glint of a television screen that looked dark. The back door was locked, the handle icy beneath the deputy's gloved hand. At first they thought maybe the family had left early in the morning, gone to visit relatives without telling anyone, but something about the stillness kept them there. The ground near the steps looked recently disturbed, as though someone had walked back and forth repeatedly. No fresh tire tracks in the gravel, just a faint older pattern dusted with frost. Eventually one deputy forced the front door open. The smell hit them first, not yet the overwhelming stench of decay, but something metallic, heavy, and raw. Inside, the air felt thick, the kind of cold that didn't belong indoors. The living room looked almost ordinary at first glance, except for the small overturned chair near the table, as though someone had knocked it over in passing. They called out again, voices sharper now. No reply. The deputy on the left stepped into the narrow hallway, his boots creaking on the floor. That was when they saw the bedroom door, partially ajar. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning. What he saw inside stopped him mid-step. Elaine lay on the bed, her body twisted unnaturally, her face swollen and bruised. Beside her was the small, still form of Peter, his skin pale against the dark blanket. Both had clearly been beaten to death. The violence was immediate and shocking, but the deputy's eyes caught something else. The faint, tiny form of a newborn lying near Elaine, wrapped in a blood-stained towel. It took a moment to understand what they were looking at. The baby's features were small and delicate, but lifeless. Later investigators would determine that Elaine had gone into labor during the attack and given birth before she was killed. The baby had survived only minutes, if that, before the killer ended its life. The deputies stood frozen for several seconds, their minds fighting to process the scene. One of them finally backed out of the room and radioed for immediate backup. His voice tight, the call went out, as possible multiple homicides. They searched the rest of the trailer quickly, though search felt like the wrong word. There was no one left alive to find. The other rooms were undisturbed. No signs of a struggle beyond the bedroom, no smashed furniture, no shattered glass. It was as though the killer had moved with precision, going straight for the family. There was no sign of forced entry. The absence of Keith struck them immediately. His personal items, coat, work boots, were still there, but his car was gone. For a moment, there was a grim question hanging in the air. Had Keith done this? It seemed unthinkable to those who knew him, but the brutality of the crime forced every possibility to be considered. If he was the killer, where was he now? If he wasn't, then where was his body? By the time more deputies and crime scene technicians arrived, the sky outside was already darkening. The early winter night pressing in. Flashing lights painted the snow blue and red. Officers moved in and out of the small trailer, their footsteps heavy on the porch. Word began to spread quietly among neighbors, drawing small clusters of people to the end of the drive, their faces pale and voices low. Inside, the investigation began in earnest. Photographs were taken from every angle, each grim detail preserved. The medical examiner's team moved carefully, noting the extensive blunt force trauma to Elaine and Peter, and the heartbreaking reality of the newborn's brief existence. There were no defensive wounds on Elaine's arms, suggesting either she'd been taken by surprise or immobilized almost immediately. Peter had injuries consistent with being struck multiple times, the kind of violence that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with his age. Detectives worked through the night, searching for any clue the killer had left behind, but there was nothing obvious. No fingerprints that didn't belong to the family, no signs of theft. Elaine's purse was still in the kitchen, money untouched. Peter's new toy train was on the living room floor. The television was off, though one detective noted that the cord was slightly pulled as if someone had unplugged it hastily. Out in the cold, search teams began combing the fields and side roads, looking for Keith's car. The idea that he might be injured or worse grew stronger by the hour. The night deepened, breath clouding in the air, as deputies moved slowly along the edges of the property, flashlights cutting thin beams through the dark. Somewhere in those first hours, the story began to take shape, not the truth, but the outline of what the public would hear. A family murdered in their home, a father missing, no suspects, no motive. In small towns, news moves fast, and by dawn the next day, people all over Jefferson County would be talking about it, each person adding their own layer of speculation and fear. But for the men still working the scene that night, there was no room for rumor, only the cold, brutal fact that someone had entered this trailer and destroyed everything inside, and that whoever it was had vanished into the quiet Illinois dark. The search for Keith began before dawn, the cold November air biting at the faces of deputies as they combed the rural roads and fields surrounding it. The frost crunched under their boots, each breath hanging like smoke in the beam of their flashlight. Patrol cars idled along the shoulders of back roads, their headlights sweeping slowly over the barren land. Every few minutes, the radio crackled with updates. Another empty field checked, another farmhouse confirmed as having seen nothing. The urgency in their voices was muted but steady. They had 3 dead in the trailer and 1 man unaccounted for, a man who could either be the killer or another victim. Keith's car was the key, a white 1981 Plymouth. They had his license plate number and description, and every available unit in the county was looking for it. But in the darkness before sunrise, the countryside felt endless, the roads repeating themselves like loops, each lined with the same leafless trees and sagging fence. As the sun began to rise, painting the frost-covered fields in pale gold, a deputy driving a back road south of Inner spotted a flash of white half hidden down a narrow dirt lane. Pulling in closer, he recognized it immediately. The car was parked just off the road, tilted slightly as though it had been driven in a hurry, and left without care for alignment. The windows were fogged, the metal glistening with frost. He called it in, his voice low. Backup arrived within minutes. Approaching slowly, weapons drawn, they saw no movement inside. The driver's side door was unlocked. The first thing they noticed when it opened was the smell, faint but unmistakable, metallic and sour. Keith was inside, slumped in the passenger seat, his body twisted unnaturally. The sight silenced the men on scene. His hands were bound with a length of cord, and there was blood dried along his collar and soaking into the seat beneath him. The wounds were brutal, multiple stab wounds to the head and face, injuries to the neck, and evidence of severe beat. His body was cold, likely dead for many hours, maybe since the previous evening. Whoever had done this hadn't simply killed him, they had attacked him, with rage, the kind of violence that goes beyond ending a life. The question that immediately gripped everyone was time. Did Keith die before his family was attacked, or after? The investigators worked through the grim possibilities. If before, then the killer would have had to take his keys and drive to the trailer. If after, then it meant Keith might have come home, found what had happened and been taken somewhere to be finished off. Either way, the scene in the car suggested he had been restrained, possibly tortured before his death. The area around the Plymouth was searched in a wide grid, deputies walking shoulder to shoulder through the tall dead grass and frozen dirt. No footprints were obvious. What little snow there had been had melted the previous day,
leaving the ground damp, but not soft enough to preserve impressions well. No discarded weapon was found, no cigarette butts, no signs of the killer lingering nearby. It was as though the car had simply been driven there. The body left, and the killer had vanished into the wind. Back at the crime scene, word of Keith's death hit hard. It confirmed that the Dardeens were all victims, removing the fleeting suspicion that Keith might have been responsible. But it also deepened the mystery. Now there was no living witness, no clear lead, and no explanation for why someone would destroy an entire family in such a personal, savage way. Detectives began piecing together the last known movements of the family. Keith had last been seen leaving work the previous evening. No one recalled him mentioning plans or visitors. Elaine had been home with Peter, expecting Keith at his usual time. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. No screams, no loud arguments, no strange vehicles coming or going. That silence troubled the investigators almost as much as the brutality itself. Whoever had done this had managed to kill 4 people, including a newborn, without drawing attention from anyone nearby. The autopsies provided more horror. Elaine's cause of death was massive head trauma from repeated blows with a blunt object. Peter's injuries were similar. The newborn, born alive during the attack, had been beaten as well. There were no defensive wounds on Elaine, suggesting she may have been incapacitated immediately or even attacked while lying down. Keith's autopsy revealed over a dozen stab wounds along with severe blunt force injuries to his face and head. The level of violence against him was extreme, far beyond what was necessary to kill. The working theories shifted back and forth in those first days. Some detectives leaned toward the idea of a random killer, someone who had no connection to the family but who targeted them by chance, perhaps stopping by the trailer under the guise of needing help or using the phone. Others suspected a more personal motive, pointing to the sheer rage in the attacks, but there was no sign of a robbery. Cash and valuables were untouched. There was also no evidence of sexual assault. The murders seemed to exist in a vacuum, devoid of the usual motives that help police make sense of such scenes. The townspeople reacted with a mix of shock and fear. It wasn't the kind of place where you locked your door in the middle of the day. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from their front porches, where the sound of a passing car at night was rare enough to draw you to the window. But in the wake of the Dardeen murders, the atmosphere changed overnight. Doors were bolted, guns were kept closer at hand, parents kept children indoors after school, strangers were eyed with suspicion. The sheriff's department worked around the clock, following every lead they could scrape together. They interviewed anyone who might have had contact with Keith or Elaine in the days leading up to the murder. They checked for recent releases from the nearby prisons, parolees who might have been in the area. They cross-referenced similar crimes in neighboring counties, but each path seemed to end in the same dead silence. One of the more haunting details emerged from a friend of Keith's, who said that in the weeks before his death, Keith had confided he was worried about the safety of his family. The violence in the area, the strange cars lingering near the road, it had all unsettled him enough that he'd mentioned moving. The friend remembered Keith saying something about not wanting to bring a stranger into the house, no matter what. Those words took on a chilling edge. If Keith had been so wary, how had the killer gotten inside? By the end of that first week, the crime scenes, the trailer and the Plymouth were processed to the last inch. Still, the evidence was thin. No fingerprints not belonging to the family, no useful fibers, no traceable footprint. The killer had either been incredibly lucky or knew exactly what to avoid. The funerals for the Dardeens drew nearly the entire town. 4 caskets, 3 small, 1 adult, were lined at the front of the church. Elaine and the newborn were buried together. Peter's tiny casket was beside hers, Keith's at the far end. The service was quiet, except for the muffled sobs of relatives and friends. The minister's voice steady as he spoke of grief, faith, and the cruelty of unanswered questions. The investigation remained open, detectives refusing to call it cold, even as leads slowed to a trickle. But privately, some admitted they had little to work with. The Dardeen murders seemed to exist outside the normal patterns of crime. They were as senseless as they were savage, and in that absence of sense lay the most frightening possibility, that whoever had done it was still out there capable of doing it again, and that there was no way to see them coming.
In the days that followed the funerals, Ina seemed caught in a strange, suffocating silence. The streets were empty, more often than not. Curtains drawn in houses where people used to wave to neighbors without thinking. The hum of conversation at the local diner had changed. Now it was hushed, broken up by long pauses, as though the very act of speaking too much about what had happened might draw the killer's attention. People locked their doors in the middle of the day. Some even kept shotguns propped by the front door. The sheriff's department continued its work, but the absence of leads was gnawing at them. Every road they went down seemed to end in the same place. Nothing. The interviews with friends, co-workers, and neighbors gave them a picture of Keith and Elaine as a loving, cautious couple who had no enemies and lived a quiet life. It was this quiet life that made the murders all the more baffling. There was no gambling debt, no bitter divorce, no drug connections, no grudges anyone could point to. Still, rumors began to grow like weeds in the void of official answers. Some whispered that Keith had stumbled across something illegal, drugs being moved through the area perhaps, and had been silenced. Others leaned toward the idea of a stranger, a drifter passing through. A few muttered about cults or satanic rituals, a reflection of the growing paranoia sweeping small towns in the late 80s. In the absence of facts, fear filled the air with its own invented logic. Detectives had to chase every one of those whispers, no matter how far-fetched. They checked the local bars and truck stops for anyone who might have been passing through around the time of the murders. They visited nearby towns, asking about suspicious strangers. They even interviewed a few local teenagers rumored to dabble in occult practices, though nothing tied back to the Dardeens. One particularly troubling lead came when a man in a neighboring county claimed he had seen a white Plymouth like Keith's speeding down a rural road the night of the murders, followed closely by a dark van. When police pressed for details, his story began to unravel. He couldn't remember the exact day. His timeline didn't match, and his description of the Plymouth didn't include the unique dent above the right rear wheel well that Keith's car had. Another dead end. The FBI offered assistance, sending profilers to consult on the case. Their assessment painted a grim picture. This was not likely a burglary gone wrong or a spur-of-the-moment killing. The level of violence suggested a deep rage or sadistic impulse. The fact that the killer or killers had taken time to restrain Keith, beat Elaine, and even harm the newborn pointed to someone willing to stay at the scene for a prolonged period. It was not the work of someone afraid of being caught. It was the work of someone in control, but control didn't mean organized. The scene had been bloody, chaotic, frenzied. There was no sign of the kind of careful cleanup that might indicate a killer experienced in covering his tracks. Yet there were no usable fingerprints, no footprints, no tire tracks worth following. It was as if the killer had simply passed through the world without leaving a trace, like a shadow that touched everything but marked nothing. Meanwhile, Keith's parents, Don and Joanne, became increasingly vocal about their frustration. They wanted answers. They wanted to know why their son, daughter-in-law, grandson, and newborn granddaughter were dead. They gave interviews to newspapers and television crews, their grief raw and unpolished. They kept the pressure on the sheriff's department, though privately they feared the same thing. The detectives did, but the case might never be solved. There were moments when hope flickered. About a month after the murders, a man arrested for a series of assaults in another state mentioned knowing about a family killing in Illinois. He claimed he had been in the area around the time. Detectives rushed to interview him, but his story quickly fell apart. He knew details about the case that had been in the papers, nothing more. Another lead came when a hitchhiker in southern Illinois was arrested carrying a bloody knife. The man had a violent record and no clear explanation for his travels. For a few tense days, investigators hoped they had found their killer,
but the blood on the knife turned out to be from a deer. He had been hunting illegally. The charges were dropped. Each false lead drained the investigation's momentum. Detectives were burning through over time, their faces etched with exhaustion. The case file grew thicker with every passing week, stuffed with reports that went nowhere. Still, they kept circling back to the same questions. How did the killer get into the Dardeen's trailer without forcing the door? Why kill Keith separately from the rest of the family? And why such extreme violence when there was nothing to gain? Some began to wonder if the killer had been someone the Dardeens knew just enough to let inside, without suspicion. Not a close friend, but perhaps a co-worker, a neighbor, or an acquaintance from church. Someone who could smile at them one day and slaughter them the next. It was a theory that made the air in town even heavier, because it meant the killer could still be living among them. The press coverage began to fade by early 1988. The murders still appeared in the local paper from time to time, usually as a brief update about no new developments. But outside of southern Illinois, the story was already slipping away, replaced by fresher tragedies and scandals. That didn't mean it was forgotten in Illinois. In fact, it became part of the town's identity, a dark anchor in its history. People mentioned it in hushed voices to outsiders, a warning of the darkness that could find even the smallest, quietest place. Keith's parents refused to let their son's family be reduced to a cautionary tale. They set up a small memorial on their property, a place where relatives could come to grieve. They kept a framed photograph of the young family on their mantle, and every holiday felt hollow without them. Don told a reporter once that he woke up some mornings expecting Keith to knock on the door, holding Peter's hand, ready to sit down for coffee. Those mornings were the worst, when reality came back in all its weight. As the first anniversary approached, detectives admitted, off the record, that they were no closer to solving the case than they had been on day one. They had theories, suspicions, and stacks of interviews, but no suspect they could point to with certainty. The Dardeens were simply gone. Their lives ended in a way that defied explanation, leaving behind nothing but questions and the lingering sense that the killer had chosen them, for reasons no one would ever understand. In that vacuum, the stories began to shift again. Some locals swore they'd heard that the killer was caught, but the police wouldn't say. Others claimed that the case was linked to other murders in nearby states. The sheriff's department denied both, but the speculation only grew. Fear turned into folklore. Children whispered about the Dardeen killer, like he was a ghost who could appear in your bedroom at night. Adults avoided the road where Keith's Plymouth had been found. It was as though the killer had stolen more than just 4 lives. He had stolen the town's sense of safety, and no one knew how to get it back. The investigation stayed open, but for the families involved, each day without an arrest felt like another small death. Years would pass before any solid theory emerged, and even then, it would be tangled in doubts and contradiction. But for now, in the quiet winter of 1988, the case remained a shadow over Enmore, stretching long across its frozen fields and empty roads, a reminder that sometimes evil walks right up to your door, and there's nothing you can do to see it coming. It was years before the first real break in the case came, though it did not arrive in the way anyone expected. By the mid-1990s, the Dardeen murders had faded from national memory, but they still hung heavy over Enmore, like a permanent storm cloud. The case file sat in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, gathering dust, but never fully forgotten. Detectives who had worked it in the early days carried it with them, even when they transferred to other assignments or retired. It was the kind of case that refused to loosen its grip. Then, in the late 1990s, a name began surfacing in connection to multiple unsolved murders across the Midwest. Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was a drifter, a transient man who traveled the country with no fixed address, working odd jobs, riding trains, and sleeping wherever he could. He was already suspected in a string of brutal killings, often involving entire families. His crimes were erratic, scattered in time and geography, but they shared certain traits: extreme violence, the targeting of women and children, and a lack of clear motive beyond the act itself. When Sells was arrested in Texas in 1999 for the murder of a young girl, investigators across the country began combing through their cold cases, looking for matches. In Illinois, one detective read through Sells' file and felt a chill. The brutality, the lack of forced entry, the randomness, it was all too familiar. He thought immediately of the Dardeens. Sells, by this point, was serving time and seemed eager to talk, sometimes bragging about murders that investigators couldn't even verify. He confessed to more than 70 killings, though many of his claims were impossible to prove. Still, in 2000, Illinois detectives traveled to meet him, bringing the details of the Dardeen case. In the interview room, Sells was calm, even casual. He didn't hesitate when they mentioned the case. "Yeah," he said almost offhandedly, "I did that." He claimed he had been passing through southern Illinois in November 1987, hitchhiking and looking for work. According to him, he had met Keith Dardeen at a truck stop. Keith, he said, had offered him a meal and a place to stay for the night. What happened next, in Sells' version, was as senseless as it was horrifying. He said something about Keith had set him off, though he could never clearly explain what, and Sells described attacking Keith first, forcing him at gunpoint to drive to a remote location where he shot him. Then, using Keith's own car, he returned to the trailer, where he claimed Elaine had let him in, thinking Keith had forgotten something. Inside, he tied her up, assaulted her, and killed her along with the couple's son and newborn daughter. He even described using a baseball bat found in the home, a detail that matched the crime scene evidence. Detectives were chilled by the level of detail. Sells knew about the placement of bodies, the order of events, and other specifics that had never been made public. It was enough to convince some that he really was the killer, yet others remained skeptical. Sells was a pathological liar, known to insert himself into cases for attention or to manipulate law enforcement. His traveling lifestyle made it plausible he could have been an in-law at the time, but there was no physical evidence tying him to the murder. Still, the confession was the closest thing to an answer the Dardeen family had in over a decade. Don and Joanne were informed, and though it brought some measure of relief, it also reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Don, in particular, struggled with the idea that his son had been killed simply for showing kindness to a stranger. It was a thought that kept him awake at night. Even with Sells' confession, the state of Illinois decided not to prosecute him for the Dardeen murders. He was already serving a life sentence in Texas, and prosecutors felt the cost and effort of a trial would not change his fate. To some, that felt like justice denied. To others, it was enough to finally have a name, even if the law never formally closed the case. But the confession did more than offer closure. It reignited old fears in in-law. People who had tried to put the murders behind them found themselves revisiting that winter of 1987, remembering the way the darkness had crept into their homes. Sells' face appeared on the evening news, a reminder that evil could wear the most ordinary mask and walk right up to your door. For the detectives, the case file was updated with his statement, but the official record still listed it as unsolved. There was no DNA to compare, no fingerprints to match, nothing that could stand up in court as definitive proof. Sells continued to talk about the murders off and on in interviews, sometimes changing details, sometimes contradicting himself. At times, he seemed almost proud of what he had done. At other times, he downplayed it, as if testing how far he could push before someone called him out. In the years that followed, other theories still floated to the surface. Some investigators believed Sells' version entirely. Others thought he might have heard details from someone else who committed the murders and was using it to bolster his own reputation as a prolific killer. There were even whispers that the Dardeens had been targeted for reasons tied to something Keith had seen or overheard, something Sells could have learned secondhand. Regardless of the truth, Sells' name became permanently linked with the case. Don and Joanne, though never completely certain, accepted the possibility. They chose to focus on keeping the memory of their family alive, rather than getting lost in the uncertainty. They spoke about Keith's love for music, Elaine's warmth, Peter's boundless energy, and the baby girl who had been taken before she could even open her eyes to the world. As for in-law, the town never really recovered its innocence. People still locked their doors earlier than they used to. Parents kept a closer watch on their children, and every so often someone would glance at the stretch of road where Keith's car had been found, as though half expecting to see it parked there again, headlights glowing in the dark. When Sells was executed in Texas in 2014, news of his death reached Illinois quickly. For some, it marked the end of a long chapter. For others, it was just another reminder that they would never know for certain what had happened on that cold November night. The killer might have been punished, or he might have walked free, his identity buried in the silence of time. Yet one thing remained constant. The Dardeen murders continued to haunt anyone who had ever brushed up against the case. It was not just the violence, though that was horrific enough. It was the randomness, the sense that there was no reason, no warning, no way to guard against it. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part of all. Even decades later, the photographs remained. Keith smiling beside Elaine, Peter perched happily in his father's arms, the newborn swaddled and sleeping. Pictures taken in moments when the future still seemed certain, before an evil stranger stepped across the threshold and tore it all away. That was the legacy left behind in law, the knowledge that sometimes kindness is met not with gratitude, but with cruelty so unfathomable it leaves scars on a whole community. And whether or not Tommy Lynn Sells was truly the one who wielded that cruelty, the shadow he cast over the Dardeen family would never fade.
The years after Tommy Lynn Sells' execution brought no real answers, only a strange kind of quiet. For some, that quiet felt like peace. For others, it felt like unfinished business, like an open wound scabbed over, but never healed. In India, the memory of the Dardeen murders lingered in subtle ways. It wasn't something people talked about openly anymore, but the caution it had taught them remained deeply rooted. Those who had lived in the area in 1987 still remembered exactly where they were when they heard the news. They remembered the flashing lights in the distance that night, the hum of police radios, the whispering in the aisles of the small grocery store. The younger generations, those who had been children, or not even born yet, grew up hearing the story in fragments, warnings passed down by parents who refused to forget. The trailer where it happened was gone. It had been torn down not long after the murders, partly because no one wanted to live there, and partly because it had become a magnet for people curious about the crime. But even without the physical structure, the land itself carried a weight. People driving past that empty lot often felt compelled to glance toward it, even if they didn't mean to. It was as though the earth remembered what had happened, holding it in the soil like a secret. Don and Joanne Dardeen had moved away years earlier. The memories in India were simply too heavy to carry there. They relocated to a quieter town, trying to build a life that wasn't defined entirely by tragedy. But the loss followed them. It was in the way Joanne kept a box of photographs in the living room, never hidden but never far from reach. It was in the way Don could still recall the exact sound of Keith's laugh, or the way Elaine would tilt her head when she was curious. Every year on November 18th, they lit 3 candles, one for Keith, one for Elaine, and one for the children. The ritual was both comforting and painful, a reminder of all that had been taken and all that could never be returned. Every so often, a new detective would review it, looking for something overlooked, some piece of evidence that could be re-examined with modern technology. They ran what little they had through new databases. They checked for DNA hits, even though the original crime scene had yielded almost nothing. Nothing ever came back. The uncertainty kept the story alive. The idea that someone other than Sells could have done it, a stranger who had never been caught, was a thought that kept some people awake at night. It meant that somewhere out there, a person capable of such cruelty might have lived the rest of their life in freedom. That possibility hung in the air, unspoken but present. Every time the murders came up in conversation, there were other theories, whispered in bars or at kitchen tables. Some claimed it wasn't random at all, that Keith had somehow crossed the wrong person. A debt, a grudge, a secret no one had discovered.
Others insisted it had been purely opportunistic, a crime of chance committed by a drifter who happened to see a vulnerable family. The problem was that both theories fit, and neither could be proven. The lack of closure made the crime something of a ghost story for the town. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the old lot at night. Older residents would shut that talk down quickly, reminding them that real people had died there, that it wasn't a game. Yet even those same adults sometimes caught themselves staring at the spot on dark evenings, wondering what truly happened inside those walls. When journalists revisited the case over the years, they always found the same thing: a mix of grief, frustration, and resignation. Don would speak when asked, though less often. As the years went on, his voice had grown softer with time, but there was still steel in it. When he talked about the need for justice, he didn't care if it came in the form of a confession, a conviction, or a simple acknowledgement from the right person. He just wanted the truth. In 2018, on the 31st anniversary of the murders, a small group gathered at the site. It wasn't an official memorial, just a handful of people who had known the Dardeens and felt compelled to mark the day. They brought flowers and stood in silence, the November wind biting at their faces. A local pastor said a few words, not about the violence, but about love, resilience, and the importance of remembering. There were tears, but there was also a strange calm, as though acknowledging the loss together made it just slightly easier to bear. The crime had left its mark on more than just the family and the town. Detectives who had worked it early in their careers often cited it as the case that taught them evil didn't need a reason. For younger officers, it was a reminder of why they had chosen the job in the first place, to stand between ordinary people and the chaos that could so easily swallow them. But it also taught them humility. Sometimes, no matter how hard you work, justice doesn't come in a neat, satisfying way. Even now, more than 3 decades later, there were occasional calls to reopen the case fully, to try again with modern forensic tools. Technology had advanced enough to solve crimes from the 1970s and even earlier, and some held out hope that maybe, just maybe, something from the Dardeen case could yield results. But each time the evidence was reviewed, the reality was the same. There was almost nothing left to test. In the absence of resolution, the story became a cautionary tale. Parents told their children not to open the door to strangers, no matter how kind they seemed. People thought twice before offering rides or inviting travelers. The murders were proof that evil didn't always come with warning signs. It could wear a smile, shake your hand, and thank you for your generosity before destroying everything you loved. And yet, for all the fear it inspired, there was also an undercurrent of defiance in Ina. Life went on. People still raised families there, still gathered at the diner, still waved to each other on the street. The murders had left scars, but they had not defined the town entirely. It was as if the community, in its own quiet way, refused to give the killer the final word. For Don and Joanne, the years continued to roll by. Friends and neighbors passed away. Children grew up. Seasons changed, but some things remained constant. On birthdays and holidays, they still spoke the names of those they lost. They still imagined what their lives might have been. Keith in middle age, Elaine's hair streaked with gray, Peter, as a grown man, the baby girl perhaps with a family of her own. Those imagined futures were both a comfort and a torment, reminders of what the murders had stolen. In the end, the Dardeen murders became something larger than a single crime. They became a symbol of how fragile safety really is, how quickly a normal evening can turn into something that changes the course of countless lives. They were a reminder that evil can be both monstrous and human, that it can arrive in the form of a stranger at your door. Whether Tommy Lynn Sells was truly the one responsible or whether the truth lies elsewhere, the story has a way of staying with anyone who hears it. It is not just the brutality that lingers. It is the randomness, the senselessness, the absence of answers. It leaves you wondering not only about what happened that night, but about how many other stories like it remain untold, hidden in the shadows of small towns just like Ina. And so on certain cold November nights when the wind moves through the fields just right, it's not hard to imagine the quiet hum of a passing car on Route 37, headlights cutting through the dark. Somewhere in that memory, the Dardeen family is still together. Keith strumming his guitar, Elaine smiling at the children, Peter laughing, the baby sleeping peacefully. It is a picture untouched by violence, a frozen moment from before the darkness came. That image, more than any police report or confession, is the one worth holding on to, because in the face of evil that defies understanding, sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is simply to remember the love that existed before. And in Ina, for those who still carry the memory of that night, that is how the Dardeens live on, not as victims defined by the cruelty of their deaths, but as a family remembered for the light they brought into a world that could be unbearably dark. And so the Dardeen family became more than just another name in a long list of unsolved murders. They became a wound in the heart of a small town that never truly healed. The trailer where they once lived was eventually torn down, the ground left bare as if the land itself refused to remember. Neighbors moved away, new families came, and time did what it always does. It buried the past under the routines of everyday life. But for those who knew them, for those who had laughed with Keith, spoken kindly to Elaine, or watched little Peter run across the churchyard, the images of that winter would never fade. The case files still sit in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, thick with interviews, crime scene photographs and dead ends. Every few years a new detective takes a look, hoping to find something missed, a lead overlooked, a witness finally willing to talk. But the silence is always the same, the questions are the same. Who hated them enough to destroy an entire family? Why leave the scene so clean yet so brutal? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, was the killer someone they knew? Even now, on certain cold nights when the wind moves through Ina, the way it did in 1987, people say they can feel it, that unease, that sense of eyes in the dark. Some call it superstition, others call it memory. But everyone agrees the story has a way of lingering. Maybe it's because evil like that doesn't just vanish when the case goes cold. Maybe it